Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're heading straight into the heart of the Thar Desert to tackle a mystery that's honestly been baffling historians, scientists, and thrill seekers for 2 whole centuries. We're going to uncover the historical truths hidden right beneath India's most famous campfire tale. So, get ready to challenge absolutely everything you think you know about the supernatural. Okay, let's dive into this. Just picture it. An entire network of thriving villages bustling with life, trade, and immense wealth. And then, seemingly in the blink of an eye, the streets just fall silent. Every single resident, gone. No noise, no struggle, absolutely no trace left behind. It's literally as if someone flipped a switch and erased 80,000 people from the face of the earth. I mean, how does something like that actually happen? Well, to really grasp the scale of this mystery, we kind of need to look at what's happening there today. Imagine it's 2 a.m. back in 2013. A team from the Indian Paranormal Society is wrapping up an investigation out in the desert. They get back to their vehicles, and they find something, well, impossible. Tiny, incredibly distinct handprints pressed into the dust on their cars. They looked exactly like the hands of a 4 or 5-year-old child. But here's the kicker. There were 0 children around. In fact, no human being had lived in this village for almost 200 years. Section 1. India's Most Haunted Village, The Legend of Kuldhara. Section 2. Masters of the Desert, The Genius of the Paliwal Brahmins. You see, the Paliwal Brahmins arrived in this insanely harsh landscape from the Pali district way back in the 13th century. And the environment they were dealing with? Brutal. We're talking Thar Desert brutal, where temperatures easily soar to 50 degrees Celsius and rainfall is practically a myth. But these guys were brilliant. They developed this revolutionary water harvesting technique called the Kadeen system. During those super rare rainstorms, they'd use the natural hill slopes to actually collect and store water. Then, over the next few months, that water would slowly, naturally seep into the ground. By winter, once the surface water evaporated, boom, the desert sand had miraculously transformed into nutrient-rich, fertile soil. It was honestly like successfully farming rice in the middle of the Sahara. So the really crucial takeaway here is that they didn't just survive, they absolutely thrived. Using this cadence system, they were somehow growing 2 crops a year in the middle of a barren wasteland. They expanded into this massive, interconnected network of 84 prosperous villages. And since they were set right on the regional trade routes between Jaisalmer and Sindh, they quickly became experts in trade and banking. Ultimately, they built a civilization that was wealthier and honestly more prosperous than the royal city of Jaisalmer itself. Just incredible. Which brings us to Section 3. The Tyrant's Ultimatum. The Reign of Diwan Salim Singh. Now, 2 crore rupees. Let that staggering number sink in for a second. Back in the early 1800s, that was an absolutely unimaginable fortune, and it was hoarded by the historical villain of our story, the Diwan, or Prime Minister of Jaisalmer, Salim Singh. Now, Salim Singh was famously cruel, but, his darkness was actually born from tragedy. When he was just 11 years old, he watched royal officials betray and murder his own father. That childhood trauma basically ignited this lifelong fire of vengeance and utter ruthlessness. His taxation policies were insanely brutal. He extorted farmers and merchants alike just to build one of the most magnificent mansions in Jaisalmer. The guy was so powerful that the actual king, Rawal Mulraj, was pretty much just a puppet. Salim Singh was the true, terrifying ruler of the region. According to the famous local legend, Salim Singh's greed eventually zeroed in on Kuldhara. The story goes that he set his eyes on the village chief's daughter and demanded to marry her. He delivered this horrific, impossible ultimatum to the Paliwal Brahmins: hand over the girl within 1 day, or he'd unleash his forces and just slaughter the entire village. They had no army to fight back with. They were completely and utterly cornered. But instead of surrendering the girl or facing a bloodbath, the villagers chose a third, seemingly impossible option. On the night of July 29, 1825, under the light of a full moon, all 80,000 residents across the 84 villages just vanished. They left behind the homes their ancestors had built 600 years prior, their incredibly fertile lands, their hand-dug wells, everything. And as they left, folklore says they cursed the land, ensuring that no one would ever be able to settle in Kuldhara again. Now, what's really interesting about this next part, Section 4, Fact-Checking the Paranormal, Earthquakes, Science, and Human Psychology. So back in 2017, a scientific study suggested that a massive earthquake actually destroyed Kuldhara and forced everyone out. They pointed to collapsed roofs and broken pillars as hard proof. But, well, a rebuttal published just a year later completely dismantled that theory. If you check the historical timeline, there was a major earthquake in 1819. That's 6 years before the legendary Exodus even happened. The next major one wasn't until 1905, a whole 80 years later. Plus, the walls of Kuldhara's homes are still perfectly aligned today. A devastating earthquake would have left massive cracks and structural gaps. So yeah, an earthquake definitely wasn't the culprit here. But what about the ghost hunters, right? The dropping temperatures, the weird audio, those creepy shadow figures? Well, it actually relies heavily on a psychological concept you might be familiar with: confirmation bias. When you are repeatedly told that a place is India's most haunted village, your brain is literally primed to find evidence that proves it. A totally normal gust of wind rattling a motion sensor suddenly becomes undeniable proof of a spirit. And there's a second psychological factor at play too: pareidolia. Our brains are basically hardwired to look for familiar patterns, especially human faces and figures. So when you're walking through a dark, dusty, abandoned village filled with crumbling ruins, your brain is naturally going to turn shifting shadows and floating dust particles into ghost sightings. It's fascinating how science beautifully explains the exact things our fear tries to categorize as supernatural. Let's move to Section 5, Uncovering the Real Culprits, Demystifying the Exodus. The actual truth here is much more grounded and, honestly, quite tragic. It was the perfect storm of environmental disaster, economic collapse, and sheer human cruelty. You see, a dam was built on the nearby Cock River, and it completely stopped their vital groundwater recharge. By 1815, most of the village wells were bone dry, making that miracle farming impossible. Right around the same time, regional security totally collapsed, which paralyzed their lucrative trade routes. Bandits were constantly raiding the wealthy villages, looting, and even kidnapping people for ransom. And to top it all off, Salim Singh just kept relentlessly jacking up their taxes. So, the most important takeaway here is that the whole overnight disappearance thing, it's a total myth. If you look at the historical census numbers, at its peak, Kuldhara had roughly 1,588 people. But by 1815, which, remember, is 10 years before the legendary 1825 Exodus date, the population had already plummeted to 800. People were gradually leaving. And even more wild, historical records show that 37 people were still living there in 1890. It was a slow, painful decline, not some magical, overnight vanishing act. And we actually have hard historical proof of this. In 1829, a British officer named Colonel James Todd documented the exact situation in his official records. He explicitly wrote about the Paliwal Brahmins living in voluntary exile. They didn't vanish into thin air. They simply migrated to places like Jodhpur, which handily was outside Salim Singh's jurisdiction, and to Atrakhani just to seek out a better, safer life. But right here is the ultimate twist of this explainer. If the villagers just migrated normally, where on earth did the terrifying ghost stories and curses actually come from? Well, the real ghost makers were thieves. When the wealthy Paliwals slowly moved away, the local rumor mill decided they must have left behind vast amounts of hidden gold. Opportunistic treasure hunters desperately wanted to dig through the ruins, but they needed the locals to stay far, far away. So they intentionally manufactured and spread these terrifying curse and ghost stories just to make sure nobody would interrupt their nighttime looting. Pure genius, honestly. And this isn't just some old, dusty theory. It was happening pretty recently. Up until the 1990s, Kuldhara was largely forgotten by the public. But then, in 1999, a local man living in the ruins called the police on 2 foreign tourists. They had actually sneaked in at night with metal detectors and were actively unearthing hidden Paliwal gold and silver coins. They were arrested on the spot, and the recovered treasure is still sitting in the custody of the Jaisalmer court today. So it turns out the only spirits haunting Kuldhara were just greedy treasure hunters. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. The story of Kuldhara isn't about ghouls or curses or some dramatic overnight vanishing act. It's the documented history of a brilliant, deeply resilient community that turned a brutal desert into an agricultural and economic superpower, only to be forced out by a tragic combination of changing climate and human cruelty. So next time you hear a spooky ghost story, will you just search the shadows for ghosts, or will you look a little deeper to salute the incredible human history resting just beneath the sand? Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the unknown.